Hello, everybody, and welcome to OAG's latest webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about planes for trains and delving a little bit into what we're seeing shaping up in some key European domestic markets. I'm joined today by John Grant, as ever, OAG's Chief Analyst. Welcome, John. How are you today?
I'm all right, Deirdre. Thanks for asking me to be here. Good to see your screens unfrozen.
Good. You're always welcome, John.
Thank you.
Do let me know if it freezes again.
Yeah, I will do.
Hopefully that'll be the last technical hitch we have today. And welcome back, a big welcome back to Wilco. Wilco, you have joined us a number of times on the OAG webinar, but it's been a little while, so we're delighted to have you back, and looking forward to hearing how things are in your part of the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me again. I think last time it was more based on how we were crawling back out of the COVID period. I think everybody kind of forgot about what the word COVID is, but I think we're still comparing once in a while to the 2019. I thought I'll mention that before John mentions it.
Yeah.
And then I hope I can give some contribution to this topic.
Great. And I'd love to say that, we've put those dark days behind us, but let's see how the rest of the webinar goes. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Deirdre Fulton, partner at Midas Aviation and regular host of OAG's webinars. Welcome to anyone new who's listening today, and welcome back to our regular listeners. We're delighted to have you here too. Okay, as I said, planes for trains. This really came out of, we obviously track capacity and frequency trends and comment on how things are evolving in the industry. And it has not escaped us that there are some markets that have certainly not recovered back to 2019 levels. And there appears to be structural change taking place. And one of those is some of the domestic markets in Europe. So we also know that there have been policy changes, and we'll talk about some of those in a little while, and really try to start to understand what are the implications for domestic markets, and what are we seeing happening. And I'm sure there'll be some other interesting things thrown in there for good measure as well. Before we do that, we like to always take a global look at what is happening in the industry. And I suppose this is the line in the sand, isn't it, every month, where we say, how is performance tracking? What's it looking like? We had a whole period where we sort of said, let's stop talking about 2019, but we're back. We're back using it as a reference point. It's a security blanket, maybe comfort blanket, something like that. I don't know. But where we are globally, certainly this month, is capacity is nearly 3% ahead of 2019 and 7.3% ahead of 2023. So that's a good story, John, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's settled down quite nicely, hasn't it? And indeed, if it wasn't for some of the factors we'll touch upon in the next few minutes, could be even further ahead. But yeah, the pandemic's behind us, capacity's growing. When you break it down by regions, there's still a few parts of the world where we need to see the numbers grow. China International is one of those, undoubtedly. Some parts of Europe and Africa are still a bit sluggish, but generally things are very strong, and particularly strong in the Americas, where capacity's been added quite significantly in the last 12 months. So I think we're in a pretty good space. And for every airline, I think, your comment about, that cloud is behind us is very relevant, because there's another set of clouds around. And these ones haven't been seeded by the meteorological office in Dubai. These are real clouds that we need to think about. So, yeah, it's a fascinating time. There's always something to talk about on these webinars and in the industry generally.
There certainly is. Very, very topical. I'm glad I'm looking out at a cloud-free sky here today, no deluges expected, but that hasn't been the case of late. Just coming back to the slide then, still a bit of a disconnect, maybe not as much of a disconnect, but a disparity perhaps between domestic and international. So domestic capacity is pretty bullish actually for the season ahead, compared to
but that's based around this growth that we're seeing in the US domestic market and also in China, where we're still seeing nearly as much domestic, in fact the same levels of domestic capacity that we saw during that pandemic period, and that's one of the big challenges for the Chinese airlines. The big three reported their operating losses for 2023, and noted a need to expand onto international markets, and they're doing that, but that doesn't address the fundamental problem of, is there an international market to stimulate? Very difficult for overseas. From an overseas perspective, China isn't the tourism destination it was 5 years ago, and that's something they need to work on. And on the outbound market, are Chinese travellers confident enough to travel in the volumes they were travelling in 2019? Yet to be proven.
Okay, well let's get the doom and gloom out of the way and start taking a look. We thought before we dive into talking about trains and planes, we wanted to really just comment, I guess, on some of the key things and headlines that are happening in the industry at the moment, because there's too much going on not to say anything about some of these things. So in no particular order, we've been talking for a considerable amount of time now, haven't we, about the challenging conditions that airlines are facing, particularly in relation to aircraft deliveries and maintenance of existing aircraft.
It's this is going to go through to the end of 2025 and maybe even beyond, Deirdre. This is our COVID replacement event. So where Boeing at the end of 2023, pre the Alaska Airlines incident, were ramping up production back to 36 units off the production line a month. In the last couple of weeks, that seems to have been pulled back to about 8 aircraft a month, which are all being pretty heavily checked through by the FAA and their inspectors before they're released. Now, doing some quick mathematics, that means if this continues through to the end of the year, we're going to see about 210 fewer Boeing 737 type aircraft leaving the production facilities, which is a big amount. And as it says on the slide, US airlines can expect around perhaps a third fewer aircraft than they were anticipated. Yes, they can replace those with extended leases, as we've spoken about on a previous webinar where we had Ishka. Those lease rates are slightly higher, inevitably, because there is very strong demand for those aircraft. United are adjusting their fleet plans and are looking at taking some more Airbus aircraft to compensate for a loss of some MAX equipment. But there's no other way to describe it than it is, messing with the recruitment drives that airlines had in terms of new pilots, which is a scarce resource already, and that's going to impact and rumble on. So
and that sort of tells you, doesn't it, that this is a key strategic issue, because taking that decision to freeze hiring is really significant, isn't it? Given what we know about constraints in terms of the pilot pool and the competition globally for pilots, I think that's a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a big issue, and I don't know what the airlines can do about it. They don't want to carry the overhead of underperforming in terms of productivity, pilots, training, investment, and all of these sort of things. So, you know, this is a decision that they didn't take very lightly. And although the US pilot workforce, the cohort is quite tightly constrained within the US market, this will rumble on into next year. And as it does, airlines like Riyadh Air, who are going to be recruiting pilots for their ventures in Saudi Arabia and beyond, are going to be competing for the same resource pool. And people who had accepted positions with the smaller carriers or with American and United may drift across to the attractions of Saudi Arabia and a new airline.
I think it's the knock-on effect as well, isn't it? In terms of lease rates are remaining high because there's huge demand for spare aircraft to fill gaps, not just for delayed orders, but also for aircraft that are going out for maintenance and not coming back when they should. And that is going to have a spin-off effect, isn't it? In terms of
completely,
if the guys are tapping into that pool, then there's
yeah. We had a comment here from Clive about the price of airfares is higher than it's ever been, and what we're seeing now is capacity discipline in place in the market once again. It may be capacity discipline that the airlines don't specifically want, but there is perhaps not enough capacity at peak times. And I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago for OAG where we looked at the average capacity per aircraft movement, and regional flying in the United States has virtually disappeared partly because of the economics, but also partly because of the resources available. You're not going to complement the two pilots. Why use them on a 50-seat aircraft when you could put them on a 170-seat aircraft and just operate maybe one less frequency a day? So we've got all of these things that we need to think about in the coming months.
Yeah, the airlines really have to juggle a lot with regarding to the aircraft, with regarding to their crew that they have available. And the capacity and the demand from the passengers is pretty high. And at the end of the day, we also have the developments in the world, like last week, unfortunately, in Israel, that airlines really have to stop flights and still have to safeguard their slots at various airports also. So it really is a pretty much juggling for the airlines.
I think those geopolitical tensions are also bubbling away, pushing up oil prices, and we saw that on the slide. We're not back up over $100 a barrel yet, I think, but this it's going in that direction, isn't it? After having come down a bit, so I think there isn't. Obviously, we've seen some capacity reductions over the last few days as a result of that, but I think it creates a little bit of uncertainty about, well, maybe a whole lot of uncertainty about demand for the rest of the summer, doesn't it? In an environment where actually demand, certainly in Europe and North America, has been pretty robust, hasn't it? And is coming back in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, definitely, and that will continue. I have no doubt about that. But demand is still going to be strong. I don't think anyone should underestimate how strong demand is going to be. We might see some migrational switching of capacity that previously, was destined towards the Eastern Mediterranean, may switch towards the Western Mediterranean. We see that every year anyway. Something happens, but no, demand is still going to be very strong.
I think it also, I think we'll be watching this summer in the Northern Hemisphere, certainly, to see how hot the temperatures get as well. And are we going to see, we were speculating last summer, weren't we, about me from a very hot Naples saying, will we ever come to this part of the world again at this time of year? So it's going to be interesting to watch and see how demand builds through the summer in those peak seasonal markets as well. So okay, let's now that doom and gloom out the window. Now out the way, we can move on and let's talk about what we said we were going to talk about. So there has been a sort of a noticeable policy shift that really began to emerge quite early on in the pandemic, when we saw governments, particularly in Europe, begin to frame their support for national airlines with conditions. So support was offered to carriers like Air France and others, but it was contingent on there being a shift in less domestic flying, particularly for those journeys under 3 hours. And you know, I think these are things that had been being discussed certainly in Europe for a significant period of time, and COVID perhaps exacerbated those and brought them to the forefront. There was an opportunity, if you like, to actually put some policy in place. So we saw the French government putting in place a bill to ban domestic flights where there could be an alternative train service of under 2.5 hours. And actually, in practice, there were only 3 French domestic routes affected by that. And there's kind of a question for me more broadly about all of these policy changes. To what extent are these symbolic?
Well,
you know,
are they symbolic?
I don't want to be cynical. I don't want to be cynical because I completely understand that actually sometimes to implement change, you have to make the symbolic changes, and you have to. Oh, apologies for that. There's a very loud motorbike passing. I thought it would be barking dogs today, but there we are. I get that you have to have sometimes a symbolic or a sort of message about a direction of travel. Pardon the bad pun. But this is difficult, isn't it? Because people want to see marked change and noticeable change. And actually, if the policy really doesn't change the functioning of a market, then
But Deirdre, so many of these are, almost political sound bites that are created without really thinking through the alternative options and what the consequences are. And the Austria is a great example where a minority party are part of a coalition, but have got a disproportionate share of voice. And, the Minister of Transport is from the Green Party, and therefore they're trying to impose things that just haven't been thought through, but create great sound bites. Similarly in France, similarly in Belgium. And if you go, Wilco is better placed than anyone, but we've seen in the past the laws of unintended consequences. At some point, I recall in the Netherlands, they increased departure tax from Schiphol and other Dutch airports, but actually it really meant Schiphol. And everyone went to Germany, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. That was 10 years ago. And I think we were a little bit of, sometimes the Netherlands is a little bit a front runner in many things. We were one of the first to have no domestic flights anymore. So that was in 2008. So I think we had a very bright view of how the future should be. But we did have in 2010, we had taxation. And then, as you said, many passengers just fled over the borders. That was taken out after 1 year. But now we do have, again, an aviation tax from the government, which is pretty steep also. And I think it's also for politicians sometimes difficult to really come up with the right balance. In one way, you want to stimulate the train. And on the other hand, you also have the CO2 emissions, etc. The further you fly, the more you're polluting. So it's also that kind of discussion on how to do that.
Yeah, I can't help but feel that we are. I don't think there is a single person in the aviation industry who is opposed to all of the work that's being done around carbon emissions and making the industry more sustainable. End of discussion. I don't think there is a person in the aviation industry who believes that there is joined up thinking taking place between the regulators that supports the aviation industry in that journey, be that SAF production through to intermodal connectivity and how that's created. And the problem here is we have, politicians, quite frankly, thinking about 5-year periods and the next voting cycle in each of their countries, when, as an industry, we're planning infrastructure and investment for the next 25 years. And if you're a financier and you're investing in these funds and these projects, you want to have confidence that what you're investing in is going to be right for the future. And without that joined up thinking taking place, we're really it's short-term expediency rather than long-term efficiency.
I think therein lies the challenge, doesn't it, in terms of, those of us in the aviation industry know that it's a long-term game, and investment in infrastructure, there's a sort of accepted model for how it happens. And you have to plan. You have to plan on the basis that what is the vision of how things are going to look like and how do you get there? And that's the challenge. It's the challenge for Europe. It's the challenge for the US, in terms of infrastructure, for other modes of travel, and how to, in an environment now post-COVID where there is no money in public services, how do we find the right balance between what people will be prepared to pay to travel and how to invest in infrastructure.
And you have the, classic example, it's coincidental that Wilco's here. For the last couple of years, you've been able to travel from St Pancras to Amsterdam by train. Very efficient, works very well, 2-3 times a day. But, it worked and people were using it. And what happens now? The service is cancelled because they need to do infrastructure development at Central Station in Amsterdam. I mean, that's like, you fire up the market, then you stop it again. You can get to Amsterdam, you probably have to change trains twice now rather than on a through train.
Yeah, you have to change it once, I think. Yeah. So it's a little bit longer, but it's to be done. I mean, you can save some time in that, and but strangely enough, it is more expensive going by train than going by plane.
Yeah.
More on that to come. And that's that. I think there's a context, though, isn't there, that we're moving, or we have moved into an environment now where everything is more expensive, and changing the mindset about the cost of travel, whether it's rail or road, or air. I think we're nowhere near that yet.
No, I think, that's really interesting. The amount of journalists who say, why are airfares so high? And you just say, well, Delta are paying 30% more to every employee than they were 4 years ago. The price of oil is a bit more expensive. We've all got to make provisions for taxations on carbon emissions and sustainability issues. Why are you surprised?
But everything's more expensive. Anyway, we're going into a spiral of doom now on that. Let's come back to the slide deck. So we said we'd look at how some key domestic markets had changed, and I think there's some interesting things here. No apologies for looking at 2019 here. We're also looking at 2014, so 5 years back, 10 years back, for the purposes of just understanding what has happened in that decade. So we're seeing a bit of a mixed performance. So we've pulled out 6 of the biggest Western European domestic markets: Spain, Italy, the UK, France, Norway, and Germany. And obviously different things going on in those countries in terms of the domestic markets that they're serving. Spain have a mainland island connection to the Balearics and the Canaries, In the UK, we have some island services too, and obviously Norway has high domestic connectivity for geography. There's a lot of mountains there. And Italy as well, obviously, has an island connection too. So to some extent, there are markets here that will always require air service. Although, maybe not. But for now, for the short to medium term, they do. So what have we seen? Essentially, Spain and Italy, over the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in domestic capacity. Norway's pretty level, but the big changes have come to some extent in the UK, and some of that is the collapse of the regional carrier Flybe, who were operating in 2019, and then France and Germany, significant changes. So, despite us saying the sort of policy change perhaps hasn't resulted in significant volumes of routes that are no longer served, there are changes underway in these markets, and there is just less capacity operating in these markets.
But Deirdre, and it's in many ways it's good that there is less domestic capacity being operated, and back to the point, any self-respecting airline knows that profitability is more likely to be generated from international routes than domestic routes, and therefore doesn't want to operate more domestic flights than they actually need to. They need the connecting flows. But sometimes when you're actually cutting these domestic air services, which perhaps are unprofitable, there aren't alternate services in the domestic market, and you then encourage people to move to international air connectivity. One of the things that's quite interesting is to see how much more traffic in Germany is flowing through other European gateways than previously went through Frankfurt or Munich, because they've lost that connectivity. And that's, we've always got to remember, passengers are like water. They will spill and they will go and take a journey with the least resistance. If that means they have to go from Paris or somewhere in a French regional market to Amsterdam to then connect onwards, ultimately Air France KLM are quite happy about that because they keep the revenue.
And you could sort of argue, I guess, I mean, it's the next level on, isn't it? For me, I always remember I live in central Scotland, and the prospect for me of being able to fly directly from a local airport internationally is a great one, rather than having to travel over Heathrow or Wilco Schiphol or Frankfurt. I'd rather do, if I'm going long haul, I want to do the long sector first. This is a step on from that, isn't it? This is about saying, actually, for some European countries, what potentially is happening is there's leakage over the border to international points elsewhere. But unstripping how much of that is muddied by the geopolitical situation, the Russia-Ukraine war, meaning that there's no overflight, and carriers are having to route in much longer sectors than ever before. So, common sense sort of dictates that you feed a central point rather than having lots of services going from different countries. I think it's hard to strip that out, isn't it?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. But I think, let's say for Schiphol or for the Netherlands, I mean, the air rail is something that we really want to stimulate. That's also, it also makes sense. I mean, we were one of the first airports that had a railway station, and we also wanted to be connected to the international railway system. Also for the future, we're trying to accommodate more. One of the examples is that we want to have a metro station from Amsterdam to the airport. And the reason for that is to free up capacity for the train system so that we can have more international trains. And the key thing is, of course, try to get that air rail possibility, the connecting traffic. and try to make it as seamless as possible. And that is, I think, one of the toughest things. I think we mentioned that you can book a flight a year in advance, but you can't book a train ticket 5 months in advance. So that is kind of like also how can we get that whole system more efficient into each other? That would be, I think, more profitable.
So intermodal connectivity is,
Absolutely.
there's a good game being talked about it, but in reality, it feels maybe like we're not quite there yet.
No, and you hear stories of train operating companies who are operating international services who literally have to stop the train effectively at the border and change the engine at the front of the carriages and the driver because he's not qualified and licensed to be on someone else's track. We talk about slots in the industry, in the aviation industry, and how precious they are at certain constrained airports. Railway lines are even more slot constrained than many airports. They call them paths, and you have to have a path, and you have to have approval, and you've got to submit an application. So there's all of those things, and that's before we get to the fact that aside from the major airports and cities, railway stations that have 3-letter IATA codes and ticketing codes, probably every other railway station certainly in the United Kingdom doesn't have an IATA code. So creating seamless intermodal connectivity becomes very challenging for everyone. And the European Union, bless them, have spent a fortune in salaries and projects and taxpayers' money, achieving very little progress in this particular aspect of intermodal connectivity. If it wasn't for the traveller being able to do it themselves, quite frankly, it wouldn't happen.
I think it's fair to say that actually, certainly those of us in the UK, and I was reading last week about challenges in the German rail network as well, that when you haven't got one operator providing a service, having integrated ticketing as a first off between different operators, if you're trying to take a journey from, not even Land's End to John O'Groats. I think Clive said he went to Prestwick from his hometown, and it was problematic and expensive. Then I think there's some way to go, isn't there? And these things are not. They are not unsolvable. The pace of digitalization should be able to help resolve these issues. But these are issues that the aviation industry has been wrestling with, aren't they? They're not new problems.
No, they're not new problems, but you don't sense that there's any significant progress being made on solving those problems. There's a piecemeal approach. There are great small companies out there who've got wonderful ideas about joined up ticketing, using latest technology and things like that. But actually, scalable development, not so easy.
It's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge. Okay, let's come back to our deck again. Just taking us sort of on a little bit, looking at these countries still. We wanted to just pull out how many domestic routes are there and how has that changed? And a similar trend as you would expect, certainly in percentage terms. The biggest loser is actually the UK in terms of volume of routes operated, and that really was driven mostly by the demise of Flybe, who had a fairly extensive regional UK network. But big reductions also in France and in Germany. And then on the bottom chart here, we're just looking at typical daily frequency on domestic routes. I guess partly to sort of understand, when I think about some of the frequency on some of the busiest routes in the world, in parts of Asia, is very, very high average daily frequency. My sense in Europe is that it's less so, and this bears out. We're not, with the exception of Germany were at sort of 4 to 6 typical daily frequency, which, if you think about some of the key trunk routes and the volume of these markets, it feels about right, doesn't it?
It's always, I've always struggled with this one, and why there has to be such high frequency on some of these domestic routes. And let's take Heathrow as an example from Scotland. There is still quite a high degree of frequency, even though there is only one carrier operating the route. And it's always struck me, why have we not got to a situation where there is a lot less frequency but more capacity, i.e. we're using wide-bodied aircraft on those services. And then we get to things about profitability of the route and the operating cost, and it's more expensive. And you don't want to use wide-bodied aircraft on short-haul sectors, and I get all of those sort of things. But then we get into even deeper things about, well, you need to have that connectivity because otherwise your screen placement in the GDS systems deteriorates because your elapsed journey time is worse. And that means you're not going to get share of the corporate market. That doesn't help you either. So it's all of these sort of things that are playing around here that mean that the frequency can, and you've got corporate demand. British Airways are not really going to go and reduce frequency to Edinburgh from Heathrow on a Friday to 4 or 5 a day when the Bank of Scotland and other high-value net worth corporate accounts are saying, what happened to the 5:30 flight from Heathrow to Edinburgh? It's gone. Because you just risk losing the business that would go via Amsterdam with Wilco to other parts of the world. So we're trapped in this sort of vicious environment that encourages us to put frequency on these types of routes.
And but then I guess your policymakers will argue that's why you need a change in policy to make that kind of change happen.
Yeah, and we might see that with this, this consultation in the UK around slot allocations in how they're used more effectively. But it's very, very frustrating that we can't sort of make these steps forward. Equally, who needs a lie flat seat on an A380 from Edinburgh to Heathrow at 6 o'clock in the morning? Unless you've been out partying. Partying at night.
I'd give it a whirl just for the experience, but that's not, no, I'll take the train. I think it's interesting though, isn't it? Because it does, and we'll come on to this a little bit later. There are a whole raft of journeys in that sort of 4 hour mark, 4 hour travel time, which could be substituted by rail. And
but I think a key thing is still that the rail really needs to bring up the capacity, and that doesn't even have to be in the frequency, but in the capacity for the international markets or whatever. Because that's one of the biggest problems. I mean, everything is already filled with the normal train passengers, and that can't really help any substitution from the air to the rail.
And I think that one of the big challenges for the German rail network was when they introduced the special fares. So you could travel. I think you could buy a rail pass for €9 a month in 2022. And the trains were bursting at the seams because obviously everybody wanted to take advantage of the fares. And so if you're struggling to accommodate normal demand, never mind pushing air onto rail, then you're right, Wilco. It's a big challenge. I think it's quite interesting. I've got a slide here which we sourced from the FT. Actually, they had done a recent bit of analysis on this, which looked at just a number of key journeys and compared. Oh, sorry, finger trouble there. So they were looking at the cost and the duration of selected journeys in Europe by train and plane. So the measure here is minutes, so how long is the journey, and then the circles relate to the cost of the journey. Red for train, and blue for air. So this, and we're hearing this in the comments, aren't we? That train fares are very high. They're not cheap. They're not coming down anytime soon. And I think that's, there's a perception, isn't there, that if you travel by rail, it should be cheaper than air. And that doesn't necessarily seem to be borne out in reality. I think unless you're booking 3 months ahead, or Wilco, booking your travel 12 months in ahead and hoping to secure a good rail fare, it doesn't work, does it?
No. Gary's made a couple of valid points about total elapsed journey time, and these are two airports rather than city centres, and you can take that on board, and I think we all recognise that. But there has to be something fundamentally wrong, and ultimately the airline went out of business when the day before travel you can buy a one-way fare from Southampton to Edinburgh for £80, and you can buy a one-way train fare that's going to cost you £240. What encouragement is there for the corporate traveller or even the leisure traveller who needs to travel at short notice to change and migrate away from air travel, which for a journey like that is going to be 5-6 times quicker? It just doesn't make sense.
And I think
in London, Paris, London.
You're kind of always tapping, but you're tapping into other things, aren't you? You're tapping into, it's a different, and Gary's making that point that the train is so much more civilized. To some extent it is. You're not going through security, you're not being subjected to, if you're a regular traveller, the frustrations that come with travelling at peak holiday periods, when you're behind everybody who hasn't remembered to take their liquids out, or all of those things and annoyances. It is a different experience. But it's interesting that for some people, it just isn't, the decision making that goes into choosing to go by rail instead of air is different for different people, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the reality. And for each industry, trying to work out which is the priority. Is it cost? Is it journey time? Is it facilities on board? It's a combination of all of those things, isn't it?
But I mean, if you look at let's say the Amsterdam Brussels, KLM is still flying to Brussels 5 times a day. They took out already one flight. They do have the intention to stop it one day, as long as the whole integration of the air rail is possible. But the only reason they fly it is that's because it's the connectivity from wherever the US or from Asia through Amsterdam to go to Brussels, and that's it. And it has nothing to do with that it's much quicker, because by the train you can do it in 1.5 hours, 2 hours, but it's more like having the whole integration in that sense. But there's nobody flying from Amsterdam to Brussels just to go back and forth or whatever for work. They will always take the car or they will take the train.
Mm-hmm.
So it is trying to get the whole integration in that, and so it's and what we don't see, of course, at an airport is how many passengers are going by train or by car that could have gone by plane. So you don't know what you're missing.
Yeah.
Difficult to capture that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. We're skipping around a bit on the slide deck, but I think that's okay. So another map, a slightly different one here. We had taken a look at the top 25 domestic routes in Europe, air routes, I should say, just to kind of see down at a route level what actually what has changed over the last 20 years. And actually, the only ones that have seen growth are those basically operating in Norway in the domestic market, as we said, serving sort of peripheral geographic communities, and routes that are going overseas, so connecting island communities. So that's quite interesting. That wasn't, I suppose I wasn't expecting that would be the results of those would be the results of that analysis. Any thoughts on that, John?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that what we were saying earlier about it's very difficult to grow capacity in some of these railway companies themselves. You know, if there was the ability to do it, companies would be doing it and would be stimulating and growing the market, and there isn't. So I think that's important. You know, but there are case studies, and we all, you know, we repeatedly go back to them. The Barcelona to the Madrids with the Aves, the Manchester London market with what was Virgin Trains and is now back in the hands of the government, I think. So that won't get any better. And then, you know, public services in France where we've got the high-speed train. There are examples where we have seen air connectivity and volumes reduce. So we know that we can change consumer behaviour, and that's great. But being able to do that across the whole of continental Europe, and not just in Europe, you know, in China and in the United States is really, really challenging. And we focused here today, we're talking about Europe. How do you get intermodal connectivity working in the United States?
It's a huge challenge, isn't it?
You know, so we're going to have to address sustainability, carbon emissions in different ways in that part of the world. And how will this work in China? You know, we're already beginning to see some switching to high-speed train on markets like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and other points where it's easier to get the train and more efficient and more reliable. So it just comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. I don't think if we were starting out on this journey, we wouldn't be starting from it here. You know, you'd be playing a computer game where you built an airport and right next to it was a railway line that connected to everywhere within 400 kilometers.
Well, yeah,
I think we can be very happy that in China they do have those high-speed trains, because for us, their domestic market will probably be bigger than the global market. That's really massive.
Yeah.
What's happening at the train stations in China?
Yeah, absolutely, Wilco, and I think also competitively priced. You know, comparable or significantly cheaper in some cases for some of those you know, city to city markets.
It's interesting. Peter makes an interesting point about how commercially attractive to the consumer will these new night train services that are starting in Central Europe.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to my slides.
Sorry, I'm killing your slide deck.
You're killing the order of my slides here, but never mind. It's fine. It's fine. You read our minds, Peter. We were interested, and it's good to know of someone who hopefully has used one of these services. But yeah, European Sleeper, I think, is what you're talking about, or referring to the concept that night sleeper trains are coming back in Europe. So yeah, John,
Well, yeah. I mean, how many consumers? You know, I get that you can save a hotel, and hotels, wow, they're expensive at the moment anywhere. So that's good. And you arrive in the city centre early morning, and you can leave your office, you know, early evening. You can have a meal on the train or a cold ham sandwich, whatever it happens to be, and you get to your destination fit, ready, and refreshed and ready to go. I absolutely get that. But that is just the tip of the iceberg of the demand that exists, and it caters for a very small part of the total addressable market. And that is the problem in all of these things. And, you know, I hear stories that some of these carriages have been refurbished using 60-year-old rolling stock because there is no available alternatives for them. So it's great that we're recycling in other industries as well. But is this really the way forward? Unless we build the infrastructure, and I think the part of the challenge is, again, going back to the clue is in the name of that product. It is a night service. It's a night service when the rest of the local markets are not traveling. It is so off peak. It is off peak, and that works for some. But to Wilco's point, you know, he has a wave of inbound long haul services that arrive between 6 and 8 o'clock in the morning, disgorging lots of passengers, many of whom potentially could be within a 400 kilometre distant isochrone, could travel by train, but there's no service.
That's true.
Yeah. I must pick up on the obvious error. Thanos has raised it. It's not a midnight arrival. It's I think it's a 6 or a 7. It's a 7 a.m. arrival. There's just a typo on that slide. That you're right. That wouldn't be a night train at all. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because here you have a company in the European sleeper who are they crowdfunded, set up as a cooperative to do this. And they're trying to do this in a sustainable way, which is great. They acknowledge themselves that actually they need to get to a point, if they want to capture the business market, who expects reliable, fast Wi-Fi, comfortable facilities, all of those sorts of things. The product needs to improve, and that needs investment, and there are lots of challenges. But I think the fact that this service got off the ground a year ago, is still operating. They're talking about expanding it, and I think this has now got on the radar of the EU in terms of they're now talking about supporting piloting night train projects across Europe. This has got to be another thing in the armory of choices for travellers in Europe, hasn't it? It has to be. It's never going to be a replacement for that high frequency, high demand environment that you're talking about, John. But it has to be, and maybe it's trying to tap into that kind of perception of the glamour of rail travel, which those of us who do travel by rail frequently know that is about as appropriate as talking about the glamour of the heady days of air travel, where it was an exciting and luxurious experience. Certainly not any longer. But I think interesting to see developments like this happening.
But it's maybe more like an experience. Like, okay, I was planning to go anyhow, so why don't I give it a try?
Yeah.
And I think what we are seeing also, at least here in the Netherlands, is that also corporates are trying to also make it also as an option that if you are traveling, you always should consider within 500 kilometers to take the train. And even though it's a little bit longer, and maybe even more expensive, that would also be in line with sustainability, that would be the most preferred way to do it.
Yeah.
So it's also education. It's also just accepting that it shouldn't always be the same as it was. And that is, I think, where we might have to go to. But it is key on capacity on the train has to be there, and make it as easy as possible, as accessible as possible.
And I don't think, ultimately, I go back to no one disagrees with the principles of intermodal connectivity. Absolutely no one. But, there are various massive infrastructure, operational issues that quite frankly probably cannot be addressed. Certainly not in a short-term period, and we have. There's a supreme irony here. We have the environmentalists complaining about the impact of aviation, carbon emissions, sustainability, etc., and notwithstanding the cost arguments and the return on ROI from HS2, those same environmentalists were objecting to the building of the railway track that would perhaps have taken some of the traffic away from air services. So whichever way you look at it, someone's got to give somewhere. And there are countries in the world, and someone's mentioned them here, Australia, Brazil, United States, where the geographic distances are so vast, and the topography is so challenging that drilling holes through mountains, cutting down the Amazon forest for a railway line, are they good environmental calls?
Yeah. There is always going to be a market for air service, I guess, in these routes. And there's an interesting question about whether EVTOLs can help join up infrastructure dots. Can they? I'm not sure. Are they high volume enough to really make that shift? That's probably a question for another day, for another webinar. The whole subject of EVTOLs.
Yeah.
Sorry, Wilco.
No, that's right. I think that will be. I mean, that's also, I think, the trend also in Norway, that they also say we also want to have we need the domestic flights, but we also want to make them as sustainable as possible. So electrified flights, etc. That's the way to the future, but it might take some time before we can get that all arranged.
Yeah, it's a journey, isn't it? Yep. Very, very bad. Yeah.
It's the longest long-haul journey in the world, quite frankly.
Yeah, it is, with plenty of turbulence on the way. Let's stop with the bad analogies. Okay, last slide I wanted to show you was just this one, which was just picking up on that point. If we looked at from Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam and Madrid, all of the destinations that operate at 400 miles or less, so a little bit more, your sort of 500 kilometer mark. There's an interesting array of potential options there, aren't there? That actually, if we were talking about a grand vision where there was a real shift from air to rail, there's a whole lot to be done, isn't there, in terms of infrastructure? So these are not domestic, not all domestic, certainly, but it's just to show really the range that could be applied.
And I mean, I can recall times I've sat in Paris CDG with a 5-hour connection to a UK airport that isn't my home, although sometimes it feels like it. And the option of being able to make an hourly train that goes from Paris to let's say I live somewhere posh, like there's nowhere too posh there, is it? Okay, East Midlands. Then that would be really, really attractive to me, but I know it's not going to happen for a very, very long time. I might be able to get the train from CDG. But when I get to London, I know I'm going to have to change trains. There's no through paths that you could take that would get you onto the northern lines out of London. So that's a challenge. And as Thanos has just made, a really interesting point. What happens to EU 261 and delay compensation when you're sitting in a shunting yard somewhere in Ebbsfleet? It's these are all the issues that we need to think about.
I think what this tells me is that Schiphol is brilliantly located, with probably the most the most opportunity, Wilco, with your with your pending train station capacity. There's opportunity, isn't there? But there has to be
to the south and to the east for sure. I think to the west, to the UK, it's still a challenge because there is water in between. So we still have to first go down south to go through the channel. So that is.
Can't you build a tunnel?
Yeah, we could. It will take some time, but
it'll take a long time.
We'll give it, but it's a longer stretch, I think, in that way. But I mean, there are those alternatives are there, but it's not. I mean, to go to Manchester by train would be still a pretty challenging thing. And just like John said, I mean, there will never be a direct train doing that. So with if you have to change trains 2 or 3 times to get to that destination, then it is not very attractive.
No,
I'm sure
particularly if you've got 20 kilos of luggage with you, and you've got to go up and down platforms and the lifts don't work, or whatever it happens to be, or you're elderly and infirm. There are so many. Well,
that's the same as in Amsterdam at Schiphol Airport. I mean, if you the passenger, nearly 47% of the people that go to our airport use the train or public transportation. So that's a lot. So that's passengers and workers. But I mean, if you look at that station, it sometimes is pretty unsafe because passengers have to bring their luggage on board of the train or get it out of the train. And it's a domestic service also, so it's
cramped.
Kind of mixed with the commuters.
Yeah, and maybe not terminating where air travellers want to go either, which adds another dimension to can we get off in time with our luggage, etc., etc.
Maybe in our next lifetimes they will have solved this problem for us. Assuming there is another lifetime.
And there was me hoping that we would see some light at the end of the tunnel.
That's
terrible. I know.
Oh, that's a nice one.
Terrible.
Yeah. We've got a picture like that. I think there's a way to go yet, isn't there? On this journey from planes to trains. But I think, and sort of personally speaking, I knew I had to get my Paris to Portofino. So the Orient Express were advertising this earlier this year, that they're putting a service from Paris to Portofino, which sounds like my kind of European sleeper travel. But maybe one day I will get the opportunity to try out the actual European sleeper as well. Probably a long time before I can afford to go to Portofino. Thank you to both of you for joining me today to engage in the debate and the subject. And thanks again to all of our listeners and for all the questions. Really interesting to hear what people have got to say about their experiences. And I think we all know it's a big challenge in this arena, isn't there?
Yeah, and just one final thought. Wouldn't it really be nice if, rather than politicians, we had someone who was permanently in this job and tried to sort it out for a career rather than for a 4 or 5 year period?
Yeah, that's a wishful thought right there, John.
Yeah.
On that note, Wilco, thanks for joining us.
John for MP.
Be careful what you wish for.
Apparently, you get a good pension, Wilco. You get a great pension.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll see you on the next one. We'll be back, I think, mid-May, so we'll come out to you soon with details of that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.